Welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to talk about the death penalty and whether or not the magisterium of the Catholic Church, the teaching authority of the Church, has contradicted itself. There appears to be some tension in some of the things that some popes taught in the first millennium compared to some things that other popes taught in the second millennium. And we're going to take a look at that. This is actually a snippet of the lecture that I'm going to be delivering later on tonight for Catholic Polytechnic University on the question of magisterial interventions and evaluating magisterial documents as part of the course by that name. And in this lecture, we're looking at the case of the death penalty, and we're evaluating various magisterial documents and propositions on the topic. In today's show, I'm not going to go through the entire lecture or anything like that, but I'm going to give you maybe some of the highlights and maybe the bare bones, essential parts that you need to know to kind of make heads or tails of this topic and kind of get an idea for why some people feel there are some tensions here in the magisterium and the teaching authority of the Church on the question of the death penalty. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let me share my screen. And while I do that, let me remind you, hit the subscribe button if you appreciate the Michael Lofton Show and you benefit from it. Okay, you should be able to see it right around now. So let's take a look here. Let's actually not go to the overall summary yet. Let's take a look at, going to scroll to the top here. And take a look at this document here from Pope Innocent I in the year 405. This is from a papal letter from Innocent I. Here is what he says. It must be remembered that power was granted by God to the magistrates, and to avenge crime by the sword was permitted. Notice the emphasis here isn't on protecting human society alone. The emphasis is on avenging a crime and the state acting as God's minister in that avenging of the crime. He who carries out this vengeance is God's minister. And then it references Romans 13, 1 through 4. Of course, a New Testament book that indicates that the state has the ability to wield the sword, and it appears to be referring to the death penalty. Here, this pope interprets that to mean the death penalty. Why should we condemn a practice that all hold to be permitted by God? So here he's saying all Christians, according to Innocent I, hold that the practice of the death penalty in the New Covenant is permitted because the state is acting as God's minister in avenging a crime. He says, we uphold, notice that relatively solemn language, we uphold, therefore, what has been observed until now, in order not to alter the discipline, and so that we may not appear to act contrary to God's authority. So he's saying that the execution of certain criminals in the New Covenant is part of God's authority, and to oppose the death penalty would appear to oppose and act contrary to God's authority. And he argues that, therefore, the discipline of executing certain criminals should be upheld. So there's a doctrinal aspect where he says that this is based on Scripture, and that the state is serving as God's minister in exacting or avenging a crime. And then there's a disciplinary aspect of actually carrying it out in society. And he says that that should be upheld. Okay, so there's that. We're going to take a look at the profession of faith for Durand of Osca and his Waldensian companions. This was a profession of faith that Innocent III put forward to Waldensians who were heretics. If they wanted to be reconciled to the church, they had to affirm this profession of faith. It's actually much longer than the snippet I'm showing you. I'm just showing you the section about the death penalty. And this was required on their part in order to come back into communion with the Catholic Church, to profess this profession of faith and affirm the death penalty, because the Waldensians were denying the death penalty and saying basically that someone who carries out the death penalty is guilty of mortal sin. So Innocent III opposed that. And in 1208 came up with a profession of faith for them. Now, originally in the 1208 version, he didn't have anything about the death penalty, but he added in the year 1210 a section on the death penalty as condition for re-entering the Catholic Church. He says, and this is also what the Waldensian heretic would have to say in their profession of faith. Concerning secular power, we declare that without mortal sin, it is not possible to exercise a judgment of blood as long as one proceeds to bring punishment, not in hatred, but in judgment, not incautiously, but advisedly. So they're having to affirm that the death penalty can be carried out without any mortal sin, as long as it's not being done as out of hatred. As long as it's being done effectively, as we saw previous popes say, to serve as God's minister in avenging a crime. Okay, so we see that, and I'll note this is a papal profession of faith, which is pretty high up when it comes to magisterial interventions. Very, very high, in fact. So it carries a great deal of authority. The author invokes his own authority. He says, "We declare." So it's relatively solemn language. And you also have the case where, again, the Waldensians are opposing capital punishment, and the Pope required their affirmation of its legitimacy in order to be received back into the church. Sullivan, Francis Sullivan, well-known ecclesiologist of the last century, has argued that whenever a group denies something and then the church requires them to profess that thing which they denied in a profession of faith, Sullivan then argues that magisterial intervention is infallible. It's definitive in nature. Ironically, Sullivan rejects the death penalty, it seems. But according to his own standard, it would seem that this judgment here of Innocent III would be considered, according to at least Sullivan's standards, an infallible judgment. Some might contest that and say, well, no, I don't accept what Sullivan is saying there. And there's going to be some room for debate. But if you accept what Sullivan is saying there, you'll likely then conclude that this profession of faith is infallible in nature on this particular point. And it would be pretty hard to argue that it's non-infallible, that it's non-definitive, because after all, it's a profession of faith. That's pretty big deal. They're not putting in side doctrine in professions of faith. They're requiring absolute essential stuff for these people to be reconciled to the church. Okay, so let's continue here. Let's maybe skip down a little bit and go to the revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So let's compare what we saw with now what Pope Francis says in the revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. For paragraph 2267, it says, recourse to the death penalty on part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Notice, by the way, it doesn't affirm the death penalty. It doesn't say before it was acceptable. It basically says it was considered acceptable, but it doesn't, say whether that's right or wrong, whether they considered it acceptable. So it's curious the way it's phrased. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of the very serious crimes, which of course kind of begs the question, why would it be then that for 1900 years Christians were not sufficiently aware of the dignity of human persons? It's a legitimate question to ask. It says, in addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Now, that's not a doctrinal statement. That's just a claim, a factual claim, which may or may not be true and certainly will be debatable. There will be plenty of people who say there's plenty of penal systems that do not ensure the protection of citizens if it eliminates its death penalty. It says, consequently, the church teaches in the light of the gospel that the death penalty is inadmissible because it's an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. So it doesn't address the question of, okay, does that mean in the Old Testament God allowed for the an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the human person? Because, of course, God calls for the death penalty in the Old Testament. Does that mean then that these popes that we saw in the first millennium, some of them who affirmed the death penalty, were they not aware of human dignity sufficiently? It seems that the Pope was under the impression that everyone was on board with the death penalty. But here it says that, it's a violation to human dignity. So it begs the question, around the time of Innocent I in the 5th century, were all Christians ignorant of the dignity of the human person? So let's continue with this. Let's now, just as far as the evaluation of the particular document we just saw. So again, from the Catechism, it's going to be debatable whether or not it has magisterial status, especially if you look at Ratzinger and some of the comments he's made about the Catechism. He tends to indicate that the magisterium in and of itself does not carry any magisterial authority, but only the references that it's depending upon carries the magisterial authority, in which case the reference for the Catechism's revision was from like a papal homily or something like that. It's pretty low level, but it has been increased through Fratelli Tutti and Dignitatis Humanae, both magisterial documents that have reaffirmed the inadmissibility of the death penalty since that revision to the Catechism. So let's take a look at the letter to the bishops regarding the new revision of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It says the new revision of number 2267 of the Catechism, approved by Pope Francis, situates itself in continuity with the preceding magisterium, while bringing forth a coherent development of Catholic doctrine. Now, I'm going to point out at the outset, even if that is true, that the situation with Pope Francis and the development in the Catechism is in continuity with the past. Let's assume that's true for a moment. Pope Francis and the magisterium has nowhere explained how those things are consistent. And I'll point that out here in a moment. So they're making the assertion that it's in continuity, but they haven't shown evidence that it is in continuity. The new text, following the footsteps of the teaching of John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, affirms, this is from John Paul again, affirms that ending the life of a criminal as punishment for a crime is inadmissible because it attacks the dignity of the person, a dignity that is not lost even after having committed the most serious crimes. I will add to that, however, John Paul II in Evangelium Vitae, which they omitted here, and they did not add this caveat, which I think they should have, did say that there are some cases where the death penalty could be administered. That is, if society can't safeguard the protection of its citizens. They left that out of this letter here, or this part of the letter, in explaining John Paul II on Evangelium Vitae. It is conspicuous that that's absent. This conclusion is reached after taking into account the new understanding of the penal sanctions applied by the modern state, which should be oriented above all to the rehabilitation of social reintegration and of the criminal. Finally, given that modern society possesses more efficient detention systems, the death penalty becomes unnecessary as protection for the life of innocent people. People are going to, of course, object to that claim. It's a factual claim that's being made here. Some people will affirm it, some people will deny it. Certainly, it remains the duty of public authorities to defend the life of its citizens, as has always been taught by the magisterium and is confirmed by the Catechism of the Catholic Church. All of this shows that the new formulation of number 2267 of the Catechism expresses an authentic development of doctrine that's not in contradiction with the prior teachings of the magisterium. So they're saying it's not in contradiction. That might be true, but they're not explaining how it's not a contradiction. Because all they're saying is, well, watch what they try to say accounts for what the church previously said, and then I'll show some deficiencies with it. These teachings, in fact, can be explained in the light of primary responsibility of the public authority to protect the common good in a social context in which penal sanctions were understood differently and had developed in an environment in which it was more difficult to guarantee that the criminal could not repeat the crime. That's not always true. We just saw several instances where that wasn't the case. We saw with Innocent I and also with Innocent III, their primary concern was not the protection of the citizens, but especially in the case of Innocent I, the primary concern was the state functioning as God's minister in avenging a crime. Now, you'll note they nowhere deal with that here. So while they claim there's no contradiction in the magisterium, what they don't do is they don't explain how there isn't a contradiction. Now, maybe there isn't a contradiction. Maybe you can magisterium explain this. But what I'm saying is they don't show you how that's the case. They just make the assertion. They then say, well, previously they were just thinking about the protection of society, but that's not entirely true. And I just proved that to you. The new revision affirms that the understanding of the inadmissibility of the death penalty grew in the light of the gospel. The gospel, in fact, helps to understand better the order of creation that the Son of God assumed, purified, and brought to fulfillment. It also invites us to mercy and patience of the Lord that gives to each person the time to convert oneself, which, again, causes some difficulties because it basically means that all of these popes and all of these Christians for about 1900 years did not know about the gospel or its implications and human dignity. A very serious claim and very serious indictment on the vast majority of Christian history, if true. So that certainly raises some significant difficulties, aside from the fact that it doesn't explain what it claims. It claims there's no contradiction, but it doesn't explain how. Now, maybe, again, there's a resolution, but it doesn't provide a sufficient resolution, is all I'm saying. Maybe it will in the future. You might have a magisterial intervention in the future that tries to harmonize it all and puts all the pieces together and shows how they all fit together. You might have that. Then again, you might not have that. We'll see. Fratelli Tutti says there is yet another way to eliminate others when aimed not at countries but at individuals. It is the death penalty. St. John Paul II stated clearly and firmly that the death penalty is inadequate from a moral standpoint and no longer necessary from that of penal justice. There could be no stepping back from this position. Today, we state clearly that the death penalty is inadmissible, and the Church is firmly committed to calling for its abolition worldwide. So even if you wanted to say, well, the catechism is of dubious magisterial authority, well, Fratelli Tutti is not, right? Fratelli Tutti is going to be magisterial. And of course, you also have Dignitas Infinita, which reaffirms the same thing. The firm rejection of the death penalty because it goes against the inalienable dignity of every human being. What they don't address is, but what about this whole bit about being the state being God's minister and avenging for a crime? They don't deal with any of that. So an overall summary that we need to consider here. So we see that some popes in the first millennium were in favor of capital punishment. Others, like Nicholas the First, were opposed to it. In the case where they affirmed it, in one instance, for example, the state serves as God's minister in avenging a crime. And so it says that that's like the main reason for the death penalty. Innocent III arguably settled the matter of capital punishment and ruled in its favor, just kind of depending on whether or not you think a profession of faith is definitive. There will be a debate there. Skipping forward a little bit, the revision to the catechism indicates there's been a development of a doctrinal and contingent nature. It says we are now more aware of human dignity, and societies are now able to protect its citizens without recourse to the death penalty. But the latter is debatable, while the former raises a number of questions, like why weren't Christians sufficiently aware of human dignity for nearly 1900 years? Skipping down a little bit, the accompanying letter that we saw that went along with the catechism, accompanying letter to the bishops, indicates that there's no contradiction because previous interventions were concerned about the safety of citizens, but this doesn't address actually that some previous magisterial interventions were based on the claim that the state avenges a crime on behalf of God as his minister. And they don't even mention this situation about the protection of society. And it also doesn't address how something that violates the dignity of a human being cannot be considered a mortal sin per Innocent III. Like, how does that work? Pope Francis is saying, it's inadmissible because it violates human dignity. Innocent the Third says you can't say it's a mortal sin to put to death a criminal. So how can something that violates human dignity be just merely a venial sin in all cases and never a mortal sin? Of course, the magisterium is not answering these questions or these tensions. This is why some people feel there's a contradiction. Whether there is or isn't is going to be certainly a different question. But that the magisterium hasn't attempted to offer a real way to harmonize all of this information is certainly evident, I think, by now, even in this 20-minute summary that I've just shown you here. So again, this creates certain difficulties and tensions, and I think that more work has to be done in showing how the magisterium is not contradicting itself, because seemingly on its surface, many people are going to conclude that there's a contradiction here. And then it's further complicated by the fact that if Innocent III taught what he did definitively, and now the magisterium is teaching contrary to that, then you would have the magisterium teaching contrary to an infallible teaching. So a non-infallible teaching contradicting an infallible teaching. It's possible, theoretically, for that to happen. Whether or not that's happening here is certainly going to be debatable. But if that is the case, that's going to cause a lot of people to lose confidence, I think, in the reliability of the magisterium if it can teach contrary to infallible and definitive teachings. So there's a real need here to attempt to show how these things can be harmonized and the magisterium's not undermining itself. As to the question of which one you would adhere to, if there is a contradiction, you would adhere to the teaching that carries a higher weight. So if, some teachings affirm the admissibility of the death penalty and others contradict it, and there's no way to harmonize them, you would go with the one that's taught with a higher weight. So then you would have to evaluate the question of, does a profession of faith, and many instances in the past from the magisterium that affirms the death penalty, do they outweigh a few instances from the most recent pontificate from Benedict and also from John Paul II and maybe even Nicholas I that deny the death penalty to one degree or another? So you would have to evaluate those documents. In fact, that's what we're going to be doing tonight in the lecture with Catholic Polytechnic University. We're going to go through these different documents and evaluate each one of them and kind of see, how much authority each of them carries. And anyways, I wanted to just briefly give you just a quick overview of this situation and why some people are going to feel that there's a contradiction and why others might say, well, no, there's not a contradiction, but there's some need to show that there's still a need to show that they can be harmonized and so on and so forth. So hopefully this is helpful in kind of giving you a quick rundown of the situation that many people have been debating for several years now, especially in this pontificate, because this pontificate has been very opposed to the death penalty. So it's stirred up quite a few debates and controversies. Hopefully it's a quick introduction to them that gives you a little bit of working knowledge to make heads or tails of the situation. If it is, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and consider supporting the show. I would really appreciate your support. Definitely need it. A great way to do it is to check out the GoFundMe link that I have in the show description, or just go to patreon.com/reason and theology. Support me there. By the way, I want to make y'all aware of rtcourses.com. rtcourses.com. Let me share my screen, show that to you. Here you can get access to various courses that I'm teaching on, for example, the 7 ecumenical councils or the theological notes, dogmas, doctrines, and heresies. You could get access to those courses there, rtcourses.com. There's also some free resources, Church Chaos, Top 10 Lies About Pope Francis Exposed. You get those for free, so free ebooks. So go and check those out. And also, if you want to get some Reason and Theology and Michael Lofton Show merch, rtmerchstore.com. Just opened it up, and you got all kinds of stuff, stickers, mugs, shirts, and, of course, my very favorite, the mug that says easily distracted by books. I mean, you can't beat that, right? Anyways, hope y'all enjoyed the show. If you did, again, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Let's go do it for today. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless. Hey, have you been benefiting from this channel, but you're not supporting it?
You're definitely guilty.
Get over to patreon.com/Reason and Theology and support this channel if you've been benefiting from the content.
Did I say get it done now?
I mean right now!
And if you can't support the show financially, you should at least be subscribed, right? Am I right or am I right?
Yeah, I think he's right.
I'm right. So go and hit the subscribe button right now.